It's a well-known fact that political campaigns cost money, big money. Take a look at this chart put together by the Washington Post. As of July 31st, Hillary Clinton had raised almost $700 million, Donald Trump about $350 million, and there's been a lot more since. It's one of the jobs of the Federal Election Commission to watch how candidates raise and spend those funds. The FEC is comprised of 6 commissioners, each serving a 6-year term. By law, no more than 3 commissioners can be members of the same political party. Joining me is the former chair, now member of the commission, a Republican nominated by Barack Obama, Commissioner Lee Goodman. It's good to meet you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I know it's so obvious, it's ridiculous. Most money ever will be spent on this presidential campaign, yes?
Yes, not just this presidential, but this whole cycle.
And what are we talking about? I mean, by a factor of what over Romney, Obama?
Looking at the last 2012 presidential election cycle, counting all congressional and presidential spending, there was about $7.6 billion spent at all levels of federal politics only. We, at the Federal Election Commission, we don't regulate state. And so far in this cycle, this 2-year cycle, the total spending is about $6 billion, and of course the avalanche of spending is coming. I don't have a crystal ball, but I would say we're probably going to be between $8 and $10 billion in this cycle so far.
In February, Politico did an analysis. You've probably heard this about 1,000 times. Let me read you the first paragraph of their analysis, Commissioner Goodman. The 100 biggest donors of 2016 cycle, this is obviously mid-primary season, have spent $195 million trying to influence the presidential election, more than the $155 million spent by the 2 million smallest donors combined. Should that concern Americans? Does it concern you?
It doesn't concern me, and I'll tell you why. Your ability to spend your own funds is a First Amendment right. But for all the hand-wringing over wealthy people giving money to super PACs, and most of that money that you're citing was money given to super PACs with unlimited contributions, most of that money was ineffective. So Right to Rise super PAC raised $120 million to vault Jeb Bush into the presidency, and it was all unsuccessfully spent. There was a group that spent over $55 million to support Marco Rubio. A lot of millionaires gave to that. And guess what? Marco Rubio is not the nominee.
But isn't that sort of asked backwards? I mean, it's sort of to say, maybe you should be concerned about these extravagant amounts of money, but you really don't have to be because they're not as effective as you worry that they are.
I think that's the point, because the argument is that all that money is going to buy the election, right? That the millionaires and the oligarchs are buying the election, but they're not. Look at the phenomenon of Donald Trump. The number you just gave is actually inflated because I believe that number includes not just money given to Donald Trump's campaign directly, which our figures show is more like $130 million so far, and $52 million of that is his own money. But it also includes money given to super PACs and other groups supporting Donald Trump.
But does buying access work, even if it doesn't buy outcomes as often as some of us like to think it does or worry it does, how about buying of access? I mean, you wouldn't deny that somebody that gives $10 million to one of these super PACs is much more likely to get a meeting with President Trump or President Clinton than I am. Is that not a fair statement?
That's probably a fair statement that some people get greater access because they participate in, but so do the heads of the labor unions, even if they don't spend money. In other words, people have access.
But they do spend money.
They do, but not because necessarily they spend money. In other words, when I worked for a governor, we always would go to the Virginia Chamber of Commerce and wanted to know, how will this affect business, or how will this affect labor? So wealthy people have, and important institutions have access regardless of how much they spend. But the important thing is this: the people still decide who gets elected. The people still vote. And despite how much money is spent to fund what? Words. Speech to persuade people. Often people listen and are not persuaded. So,
but they have more speech than I do, Lee Goodman. They have more ability, and more than you do. Well, you can't probably have speech, political speech now, I assume, in your job. I mean, that inequality, I mean, you know the Democrats, the Antichrist is Citizens United. And I'm assuming you think on free speech grounds that's a pretty decent decision. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I do, but here's why. You know, the Supreme Court ruled, not in 2010 in Citizens United, but in 1976, in a per curiam decision called Buckley v. Vallejo, that you cannot restrict First Amendment rights of wealthy person just because Lee Goodman doesn't have the same amount of money. If I could restrict your rights because you're wealthier and have more resources than I, then I could restrict on that basis the New York Times and WGBH and the Washington Post, because guess what? Those are big, well-funded corporations who have greater speech than I do, and the First Amendment will not tolerate it, and that's been the law since 1976.
If Jeb Bush were the nominee of the party, what would your answer to my first question have been about whether or not that concentration of giving by 100 of the biggest donors, what would your answer be if the money had produced the outcome? Because like I said, I used to do ballot campaigns for a living, almost without exception. The team with more money wins the ballot campaign, regardless of merits, regardless of power of argument. What would your argument be then?
Well, that's a hypothetical, a what if, and it didn't come to fruition. And in politics, we often see the people who spend the most money or who have the most money spent on their behalf, they often don't win. There are so many other influence points.
But is that really your primary argument, that it may not lead to a victory? Isn't the argument about whether or not it's a constitutionally protected activity, which by 5 to 4, obviously unlimited spending in certain settings is now? It's not what the consequence of that spending is, or is it?
Well, I think that's the argument you were just positing in the question. You were saying, what would be the consequence of all that spending?
And if the consequence was that the desired outcomes were purchased, for lack of a less offensive term, would you still have the same position?
I'd still have the same position, because a lot of money was spent on behalf of other candidates as well. And the other thing I want to emphasize is, and I know you want to focus on spending at the high end, one of my goals at the Federal Election Commission is to relieve regulation on populist voices
like internet,
on the internet and at state and political parties.
But aren't you worried? There's a partisan split, from what I understand, on the Federal Election Commission. Your Democratic colleagues say it's dysfunctional, it's not going to enforce things. I know you don't agree with that. But the internet, for example, aren't you falling behind evolving technology? That's where ultimately the persuasion is going to end up. And your position that it's not our job to regulate it pretty much creates another loophole, does it not?
Not a significant loophole, and here's why. Because a judgment was made at the Commission 10 years ago that I think still holds, that the vast majority of internet communications, especially on your own website and on social media pages, is low cost and free and non-corruptive. So I can create a video and I can post it on YouTube, I can run a blog, and the production costs of that are so low that they are almost by definition non-corruptive. Here's what we do regulate. If you run an ad, a banner ad or any other kind, and you pay a third party to run that ad, we still regulate that like a TV ad or an ad in the Washington Post.
How about those private companies we've read about lately that are created almost exclusively to shield the identity of donors, so the private company can go on and give tons of money to the super PAC?
They can be a problem. They can be a problem. And
so can you agree with the Democrats on that on your commission?
Yes, and we have. Here's what happened. We had some fly-by-night LLCs set up by people where it looked like they were set up merely to shield identity. However, the law had been unclear up to this point, because Citizens United now said LLCs and corporations can give. So here's what we did. We issued a statement, the 3 Republicans, that henceforth, if you do this, if you funnel money through an entity that you set up just for the purpose of funneling money to a campaign, that will be giving in the name of another, and people can go to prison for giving in the name of another.
Glad to hear that. Nice to see you, Lee Goodman.
Thank you for having
so
me.
much. Pleasure to meet you.